Hello, my name is Giorgio Morales and I will be presenting our paper Univariate Skeleton Prediction in Multivariate Systems using Transformers. To begin with, there is no doubt that after the boom of deep learning, we created outstanding models that were capable of outperforming classic machine learning methods and even human performance in many application areas. But now we have models that are too complicated to explain or to interpret. So these black box models are not very suitable for applications in which the exact objective is to understand the underlying processes that are behind the data that you collected. That's a problem because one of the goals of science is to discover mathematical laws or equations that serve as causal explanations for the observable world. That's where the field of symbolic regression gains a lot of importance because it aims to do exactly that. We're going to have data sets of observations that we're going to process using symbolic regression, and the objective is to obtain a mathematical expression that can be a full equation like in this case, or just a symbolic skeleton that is describing the functional form or the behavior of the data that we collected. So we're going to focus on the multivariate symbolic regression problem. We consider a multivariate system whose output is a function of t variables, and f represents the underlying function of the system. We assume that f can be expressed as a mathematical expression that uses unary operators like these ones and binary operators like these ones. And the goal for a general problem of this type is that when you're given a data set of observations, you want to obtain a mathematical expression f tilde that approximates f. And before moving on, I want to explain what is a symbolic skeleton expression. So suppose that you have an original function, its corresponding skeleton will be this one. Basically, we are replacing all the constant values with constant placeholders. So now this skeleton is just describing the functional form of the original function. There are many problems associated with existing methods. One of them is that their primary focus lies on the minimization of the prediction error that is produced by the expressions that are being learned, instead of identifying the functional form that is most suitable for the data that you collected. In addition, many methods rely mainly on genetic programming, and as a consequence they suffer from a slow computation because the search space is huge. These methods also have the problem that they don't consider past experiences, and this is also true for many other methods like symbolic neural networks. Now, there are methods that don't necessarily suffer from the previous limitations, but in multivariate systems, they often fail to identify the functional form that explains the relationship between each variable of the system and the system's response or the system's output. So now let's talk about contributions. And the main one is a method that learns univariate symbolic skeletons that explain the functional form between each variable of the system and the system's response. And we're tackling the multivariate symbolic regression problem as a sequence of a new type of problem that we're calling multi-set symbolic skeleton prediction, MSSP. And to solve this problem, we're presenting a novel transformer architecture that is called multi-set transformer, whose objective is to generate symbolic skeletons that explain the functional form between a selected variable and the output of the system. So let me justify the need for this type of problems. Let's consider a system that is a function of these two variables and that we have collected a data set that is huge in this case. So suppose that we want to analyze the relationship between variable x1 and the output of the system. If that's the case, then I should isolate the effect of variable x2. So I'm going to fix it to a random value. In this case, suppose that we are selecting the value phi. So from this dataset, I'm going to select the samples in which variable x2 is equal to phi. That means that I'm going to create a subset, and I can plot that subset to analyze the functional form. I would obtain something like this. So I can take this subset and process it to a symbolic skeleton prediction model. In this case, I'm using the Nesimres method that was proposed by Billo et al. In 2021. And in this case, I'm obtaining this quadratic skeleton, which makes sense because this function looks quadratic pretty much. But that's not the correct skeleton that I was hoping to obtain. So the question is, what if I had selected a different value for variable x2? What if instead of the value phi, I had selected the value 0.1? then the subset that I created will be something like this. If I repeat the process using the nesting rest method, then in that case I would have obtained the correct skeleton. The problem is that during inference I don't know which skeleton is correct because I don't know the underlying function of the system. That's what I'm trying to get. So it really depends on context. So we observe that when we're analyzing one specific variable and fix the values of the remaining variables, we can project the function into a new space in which the functional form is not easily identifiable. So we argue that the classical SSP problem will benefit from the injection of additional context data. That's why we're proposing to process the information from multiple sets simultaneously to produce a symbolic skeleton that is common to all input sets. We're going to refer to this new problem as multi-set symbolic skeleton prediction. So again, from the same problem, instead of fixing variable x2 to a single random value and hoping for the best, we're going to fix it to multiple values that are going to generate multiple sets that may correspond to different behaviors, but we know that all of them correspond to the same functional form. So these sets are going to be fed into the MSSP solver, and the objective is to generate an estimated skeleton that is going to represent the functional form that is common to all input sets. Now, to solve this problem, we can't use a simple transformer because they were designed to process sequences with fixed orderings, which is not the case for sets. In the case of sets, we can permute all of their elements and the semantics remain the same. Also, there's another type of model that is called a set transformer, but it only processes one set at a time, and we're using multiple sets as inputs. That's why we're proposing a multi-set transformer architecture to solve the MSSP problem. The objective is to pre-train this model on a large data set of synthetic expressions so that it's ready to perform inference for whenever we receive data from an observed phenomenon. And this is a simplified representation of the multi-set transformer architecture. We can see that all input sets are being processed within the encoder. Specifically, each set is processed by an encoder stack, which is a sequence of induced set attention blocks that were proposed in the set transformer paper. So we're obtaining encoded representations for each input set. Then we aggregate all of these encoded representations using an attention mechanism into a single latent representation that is later processed by a decoder stack, which is the same that is used in the original transformer architecture. And we're generating the elements of the output skeleton in an iterative way until we generate the end of sentence character. So this estimated skeleton is basically a sequence of tokens that represent an expression that is written in prefix notation. For example, if we have an expression like this, we can represent it in prefix notation using a sequence of these tokens. That can be translated into a sequence of integer numbers using a vocabulary that we defined. So as I mentioned before, we generated a large data set of symbolic skeletons, and by the way, you can find in the appendix of our paper our generation method, which is different from what previous works did. We found out that their approaches had an important bias towards the generation of very simple expressions, and an expression that looks like this had a very low probability of appearing. So once that we generated these skeletons, we can generate sets of input-output data that are different by selecting different values for these constants. Like we see in this example, these are functions that behave differently because the constant values are different. Now, everything that I described so far was to train a multi-set transformer model on a large data set of generic and synthetic expressions. Now we're in a different context in which we have just collected the data about the specific phenomenon that we're studying, and we have questions. We want to understand what's the functional relationship that relates each variable of my system with the output that we're observing. And to do that, we're going to use the multi-set transformer that we have already pre-trained, right? So the first step is going to be to approximate the underlying function of the system, which we don't know, and we're going to do that by using a neural network. using the data set of observations that we have collected. And we train our network by minimizing the error, the mean square error, basically. So now suppose that we're analyzing one specific variable xv. In this example, xv is equal to x1, and we want to synthesize multiple sets by fixing the remaining variables, in this case x2 and x3, to random values. And they're going to have different values each time. And by doing that, we're creating multiple synthetic sets. We can estimate the response of those sets using the neural network that we trained before. So now we have a collection of multiple sets which are input-response pairs, right? And that is the definition of our multi-set transformer. We're going to feed all of these multiple sets into our pre-trained multi-set transformer. And the output is going to attempt to describe the functional form that all of these input sets have in common. And finally, I want to describe the performance evaluation method that we're using in this work, which differs significantly from what has been done in previous works, because we're not generating yet the final estimated underlying function that combines all variables together. We are instead at the point in which we generate one skeleton function per variable, and we want to assess if those skeletons correspond correctly to the real relationship between each variable of the system and the output of the system. We also want to see how these skeletons compare to those generated by other methods. So let's use this example to illustrate that. Suppose that we have a function that is multivariate and we are extracting the skeleton that corresponds only to variable x1. And we have it here. And we do the same for expressions that were generated using other methods. The question right now is if the first estimated skeleton is equivalent to the ground truth skeleton. And turns out that if these two expressions are equivalent, it doesn't matter if they're using different operators. If they're equivalent, they should be so for any combination of coefficient values I decide to use. For example, if I sample from this skeleton this function using random constant values, and then I sample multiple values for x1, I can obtain a corresponding response. Using that response, I can fit the coefficients of the first estimated skeletons, and if they're truly equivalent, I should be able to find a combination of these coefficient values that will minimize the error between those functions. And I would obtain something like this. This is the corresponding function that I fit. It's going to be the same if I decide to use another function that belongs to the same family. I'm going to find this function that has this skeleton, and the distance between these curves is going to be minimum. Now, it's going to be different for the other case because we already know by knowing math that these two functions are not equivalent. So again, I generated this function and I generate data with it. If I use it to fit coefficients for this second skeleton, this is the best that I can do to minimize the distance between these two curves. And it's going to be similar for the other function that I sampled. So what is happening is that because this skeleton is not describing the real functional form of this skeleton, we cannot find a curve that matches perfectly. And that's going to be true for any function that belongs to this family of functions, to this skeleton function. So we're going to use this area, this error, as a metric, a similarity metric, to describe how close two skeletons are. And we're going to repeat this operation of sampling functions 10 times. So for our experimental results, we created a data set of 1 million of expressions for training and 10 to the 5 expressions for validation, allowing up to one nested operation in the skeletons that we generated. These are some of the architectural details, and of course you can find all of the information in the paper. And also the dataset is available at Hugging Face. So we are using synthetic problems to verify our results, and those problems were generated from known underlying equations. Some of the equations that we consider in this work were taken from previous papers, and others were proposed in this work. The objective is to use a challenging set of equations with different operators. And I also extended the range with respect to the equations that were proposed in the original papers, just to make the problems a little bit harder. Now, this is an example of the type of results that we obtain, in this case for problem E2, whose underlying function is this one. The ground truth skeleton for variable x1 will be this one, for x2 this one, and x3 this one. And we're comparing the skeletons that were generated by our multi-set transformer to those generated by other methods. In this case, N2N or E2E proposed by Kamiani et al. In 2022, NesimRes proposed by Biggio et al. In 2021, Taylor Genetic Programming (GP) proposed by He et al. In 2022, and PySAR, which also depends on GP, proposed by Kramer in 2020. You can see that in the three cases, our multi-set transformer is generating skeletons that are equivalent to the ground truth. And in this case, we can argue that E2E is also generating an equivalent skeleton because C2 can always be set to 0. But what we notice is that it tends to generate skeletons that are unnecessarily longer. But in this case, there's no way that these two skeletons can belong to the same family of functions. We also calculated the performance metrics that I described before for all of the methods and all of the equations using 10 iterations. Here we are reporting the mean error metric and the corresponding standard deviation. Everything that is highlighted in bold means that the method achieved significantly better results than the other methods. You can see that in all of the cases, the multi-set transformer obtained the best or one of the best results. E2E also does a good job. But the main difference is that it doesn't identify the correct functional form consistently for all of the variables of the systems. It focuses mainly on the variables that are more relevant for the minimization of the prediction error. Whereas in our case, we obtain a correct skeleton for all of the variables in all of the cases, mainly because we have separated the problem of identifying the functional form of each variable independently of the other variables. So we are not focusing more on one variable than the others. In conclusion, our work aims to establish the basis for a decomposable symbolic regression method. And to do that, we're presenting the first neural symbolic regression method that prioritizes the identification of the functional relationships between each system variables and the response of the system. Our method actually allows for a deeper understanding of how individual variables contribute to the system's behavior. And experimental results demonstrate that our multi-set transformer model learns to identify skeletons correctly and consistently for all of the system variables. In the end, our method can be viewed as a post-hoc interpretability method that generates mathematical expressions as interpretations of a black box model's function.